And so welcome everybody to A Convincing Ground, which Peter Geyer's examination of people and communication in the Australian referendum. If you could mute yourselves. Now I've been enjoying communicating with Peter over the last couple of months really while he's been preparing this. And Peter is an Australian who's been researching and writing and teaching about Jung's theory of psychological types in the MBTI for 35 years. And it is 5 a.m. for Peter. So we're especially grateful, Peter, for you making the effort to join us. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see how it goes. I have no idea what I'm going to say.
Are you ready to start screen sharing now? And yeah. Peter says if you have questions, either shout them out or put them in the chat. Basically, you're happy to be interrupted. Was that right, Peter?
Yes, that's my general thing. Interrupt is sometimes a negative word, but for me, it's a good word because then if you have something on your mind, then it's better to actually say, but what about X? Or what about Y or that sort of thing. And I'm quite capable of saying I have no idea.
Okay.
So because
slides then, Peter. Okay.
Okay, I'll talk to the slides. There's a paper that I've written for this, which is much longer, and it's available on the thing. And so they overlap. And part of the reason it's longer is that there are several pages of references. And that's for you to think, oh, maybe I should look at this or look at that. Have I read all the references? No. But it's that I like people to actually look at references. Okay. This is the convincing ground. This is a photo from 2006, and that's an Indigenous woman there. Looks a bit messy. It's actually near the beach in a place called Portland, which I'll explain later on. Convincing ground, which I might explain with the slides. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, I better explain that. Okay, this is a thought piece, as in, this is what I'm thinking. It doesn't mean that I'm right or anything like that. I'm interested in the nature of psychological consciousness. And in my view, one of the things that gets lost out is that we say personality type in the type community, but Jung spends all his time saying psychological. So it's psychological consciousness, not any other consciousness. Nobody knows what consciousness is anyway. The title is my thought about how are people convinced, as in if you have to vote, say in a referendum, are people convinced, or is that not the point at all? What happens when you go to vote? I'm interested in emotions in discourse, which may sound strange for an INTP, because I have no idea what emotions are, but that's probably a reason for doing it. And also, I'm interested in the meanings of words. And so, when people say thinking, what do they mean? It's not thinking means this and that. It's but I'll get to that later on. And I'm interested in labels in the sense that type is partly about labels, but we can actually go to stereotypes without thinking about it. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, the theme is people can do or not do the same thing for different reasons, or for no reason at all. And I found that, why did you do that? Oh, I don't know. And so sometimes when you can say in type terms, oh, you're an INTP, so you must do A, the odds that you've never done it, have never thought about it, or even dislike it are actually quite high. And that can relate to all sorts of types. And so it's the cultural, family or national backgrounds that might be significant in that sort of sense, as well as your, what I call your typological predilections. So my point is that there are exceptions to every stereotype, including typological claims. I think Steve Myers spent some time a couple of years ago presenting what he called the MBTI types, which is actually contradiction in terms, in my view, as stereotypes. Now, that's actually not correct, but they can be used that way. You know, the other point, and this relates to writing about consciousness, Oliver Sacks's book, The River of Consciousness. People move in and out of psychological consciousness, and so therefore can't always access their preferences. Naomi Quink used to make this clear. So sometimes what somebody does or thinks doesn't have anything to do with their preferences at all. Or they're in a situation where it's actually not relevant in that sense. So that's my theme. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is another view of the convincing ground. You can see the beach there. There's an island out the back where the local Indigenous people think that people's spirits go when they die. They call it Dean Mar. It's actually Lady Julia Percy Island for us settler Australians. So Portland's about 350k west of Melbourne. I used to live about an hour from there about, well, 16 years ago. Now, convincing ground, you can use a metaphor, means you need some convincing. So in casual language, we're going to fix you up. So this is a clash between whalers, actually, and the local Indigenous people over a beached whale. So that sort of thing. The Umarella Wars are a generic term for battles with the local Indigenous people in the area. And Portland is the first permanent European settlement in the state of Victoria, so 1835 or thereabouts. Okay, so this is a more recent photo than the other one. The bloke at the front has something that says always, and so Indigenous people say always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Okay, because their notion of land is different to the European idea, or John Locke's idea, really, which we sort of follow from. Next, please. Okay, something about the Indigenous people of Australia, or First Nations these days. There's an interesting definition of nations. First arrivals these days, it's agreed somewhere between 60 or 80,000 years ago. Someone claims 100,000 on the basis of charcoal evidence. If you run into an Indigenous person in whatever way, they will say they've always been there. Okay, notwithstanding that science says that people initially come from Africa, wherever it sort of goes. Okay, there's lots of different languages. I think the next slide's going to be a map. Some are mutually incomprehensible. I was in a lift in a place where I worked about 30 years ago, and there were two Indigenous women there, and one of them, and they came from the Kimberley, which is in Western Australia, and one of them says, we come from the same area, but I don't understand a word she says. Okay, yeah, highly eccentric woman. She actually was sitting on the floor of the lift, but that's another thing. Okay, so their belief system is sophisticated, connected to the land, and it's a psychological connection in that sense. So it's not, there'll be European equivalents in a particular way, but not the same. Sophisticated land management strategies. This used to be disputed when I was growing up, but settlements or permanent housing existed in some places. And of course, when the Indigenous people were here, Tasmania was connected to the mainland. That's up to 20,000 years ago. And Port Phillip Bay, which is the bay that Melbourne is on, from what I can work out, has only been in existence for 1,000 years. So, you know, which is, but anyway, you can see that I'm a person who likes history. Well, can we go to the next one, please? Okay, this is a map of Indigenous languages. So that gives you an idea of where it is. If you're not familiar with Melbourne is down the bottom. In that sort of, there are several languages and all that, but that sort of gives you the idea. There's some work trying to resuscitate languages. Language relates to identity for Indigenous people in the United States and elsewhere as well. Have the next slide, please. Okay. I like maps. You probably worked that out. Europeans in the Great South Land. I was going to put up Ptolemy's map of the world because his presumption was that there had to be land at the bottom of the earth in order to balance the land at the top. So ancient maps, you see New Holland or Terra Australis, whatever. Portuguese or Dutch exploration, 16th, 17th century. Where I lived in Warrnambool, which is an hour from Portland, there's a story about the Mahogany ship, which was a ship on the beach, which was presumed by some people to be Portuguese. And so, you know, from the 16th century or something like that. William Dampier in the west, James Cook up the east coast, and of course the founding of British penal colony in 1788, which some people think is the founding of Australia. Melbourne was not founded by convicts, and nor was Adelaide. So there are interesting sorts of things about that sort of thing. Am I descended from convicts? I don't think so, but that's another thing. The Australian states or colonies were federated in 1901 by an act that was passed in the British Parliament in that sense. So there's still other things. Next one, please. Okay. If I was an Indigenous person, I think this applies to Native Americans as well. You actually say where you come from, but it's also the case in places like China and the Middle East. How do you identify yourself? Okay, so I'm a fifth generation male settler Australian. This is from 1959. And so that's my father at the back, my sister, and then there's me. So I'm about 7, I suppose, in 1959. We're actually on a ferry in between Sydney and Brisbane because the roads weren't connected at that point. Okay, so my ancestors are German and Irish who came here from India in 1857. My mother's ancestors are English who come from Tasmania. And so that gives you the context for where I come from. I'm also a working class boy from the western suburbs. And that actually gives you an insight into how I speak and the background that I'm in. It's a working class area. Actually, where I grew up is no longer a working class area in certain things. I'm an INTP in the context of that's actually how I express myself. Okay, so that doesn't mean that I'm going to be like other INTPs in particular ways. I dislike being called an Aussie because I'm an elitist. And I dislike baby boomer because I think it's an appalling label that can't be justified. And I say in the paper that it's improbable to actually make sense of categories that are over 16 years of people's experience. Actually, there's a book on baby boomers I ran into yesterday that actually claimed various things about what baby boomers would have experienced, and this is just the review, and none of them were true for me, you know. So, oh, a red brick house, no, sorry, weatherboard, those kinds of things. Okay, I live in Werribee, which is an Indigenous name, and this is Wattawarong country, or Wathaurong country, depending on how it goes. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, these are the particular clan groups that are around Melbourne. Where Wattawarong is in there is actually where Werribee is outside of Melbourne. So that gives you the idea of the different languages. Melbourne is Wurundjeri country, and the boundary between Melbourne and the Wattawarong things is actually the Werribee River, which is a small stream that's a couple of K away. Naarm is actually the Indigenous name for Melbourne. I actually like Naarm, Melbourne, don't care. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this is a sign. The state roads thing puts up these signs, and so you're in Wattawarong country, and what that means is that the Werribee River is just to the right. If you're a settler Australian, there's a racecourse on the left, and there's a Catholic church on the right. Okay, which is ubiquitous in a particular way. My car's hidden from that. You get to where I am now. I'm about 2 kilometres away. You just sort of go north. But, you know, these signs are actually everywhere in Victoria. You know, whether some local Victorians like that is neither here nor there. Okay, the local council, which is called Wyndham, much prefer Werribee, but what the hell, this is an acknowledgement of country, which actually happens at particular sporting events, and various organisations actually do this kind of thing. So traditional owners of the land. Okay, now the presumption is that the people belong to the land. Is different to the European perspective. It says we pay respect to their ancestors and elders, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, I think there are a couple of Indigenous people that are around in Werribee, but you don't actually see them. You actually see more Italians and actually Indians. The Wyndham is the fastest growing municipality in Australia. So that's what next one, please. Okay, settlers, pioneers, explorers, invaders. Some people don't like the term invasion, but seems fair. Now, the settling of Australia, if you like, are similar to other European incursions from the late 15th century. So you're looking at the Spanish, you're looking at the British in the United States, and actually also the Americans. You're actually looking at the Germans in Africa. It's a general sort of thing. So people turn up and they just stay there. There's apparently an Indigenous mob in northern Western Australia that are still waiting for us settler people to go. You know, so there's that sort of thing. Okay, frontier violence means you're not allowed to touch the sheep or something. It means all sorts of things. Appropriation of land. It's a fascinating intellectual thing in that you can turn up, as in the Portland example, and say, well, this is ours. And the other people, the Indigenous people, in a lot of senses, not seen as human. then again, in the 19th century, women weren't seen as human either for some people. So it depends on how you want to look at it. And the term primitive, which Jung actually uses quite a lot, we'll get to that one point. Indigenous people confined to missions. The idea was to convert them to Christianity. Actually, in one part of Western Australia, it's to convert them to Spanish peasants, but that's another thing. Language and beliefs are banned and also exploited as workers. There's only ever been one treaty made, and it's a questionable one, between settlers and Indigenous people, and that was by John Batman in Melbourne. And because it wasn't approved, that was that. But there's never been a treaty between Indigenous people and settler society. Now, the Americans are different. They've made lots of treaties, but they actually haven't abided by any of them. So it's one of those sorts of things. Stolen generation, which still goes on. Children removed from their families for their benefit, so-called. And yeah, there's all sorts of things that go with that. Also, and this quote is actually from a school text that I was set in the mid-60s. The idea was that they were dying out, and this is because the superior culture had turned up. And there's a particular view of evolution in a particular way. And so the phrase in this book was called smoothing the dying pillow. So we've got to look after these people because they're dying out. About a week ago, there was a report that there were eugenics practices against Indigenous people because there were too many Indigenous babies being born, and that was in the 1950s and 1960s. So there's those sorts of things. There's a comment on the chat, which I can't see because I'm an idiot.
Oh, I was just sharing that a lot of this relates, but in a different way in the Canadian experience, where it becomes the question of like which is worse, a lack of treaty or a broken treaty. Yeah, but that's just like two devils, yeah, really.
Yeah, when you look at journal articles, a lot of articles on Indigenous people and things like that are actually from Canada. It's Canada and here more than anything else, and the language is very, very similar in terms of I'm going to use the term autonomy more than anything else. How do Indigenous people get to live their lives in the way that they understand it in that particular way? Do you want to?
I was just saying, it just seems like the ego on a collective level was pretty strong, eh? Back then.
Yeah, it's interesting. Not being an Indigenous person, I don't know what it feels like or thinks like to actually have an entirely different relationship to the land, I suppose, is the easiest thing to do. Can we go to the next thing, please? Okay, I found this by accident. Only cost me $2. I actually use the Dewey system, so that's the number down the bottom. But this is a booklet that was given to school children in 1951 because it's the Jubilee, 50 years of Australia. Okay, there is no mention of Indigenous people at all. And that's kind of, I've got a collection of Australian history books, some of which I've actually picked up recently, and they either get a brief introduction or not one at all, because the main thing is to actually talk about Australia, the settler state, in that sense. That doesn't mean Indigenous people were necessarily hated, but it means that they weren't important, which is still an issue now. But yeah, it's an interesting booklet. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. Now, we haven't got to any of the psychological stuff first, but I thought I would actually explain what Australia is like, because some people, including Australians, don't actually know much about the system. Okay, so Australia is a constitutional monarchy. King Charles is the King of Australia, which causes a bit of amusement. And what's these days called a liberal democracy, which is a term that didn't come into vogue until the last few decades. People actually don't ask what liberal democracy means, but that's part of unconsciousness. Okay, mentioned before, Constitution, British Act of Parliament. Australia is one of the few countries in the world that makes voting compulsory. You have to vote. Actually, you don't have to vote, but you have to turn up and get your name crossed off the list, and you can write obscenities or drawings on the paper, and then that's sort of that. So voting's been compulsory for 100 years. And voting is by preference. So if there are 8 candidates, you've got to number them 1 to 8. And if your number 1 preference has the least votes, well, then their preference votes are distributed to the others. So it's not as though it's saying, well, actually in England, presumably in Canada, but I don't know. But in the United States, it's first past the post, which means that you can be elected and really not too many people have voted for you, but there's that sort of thing. Okay, for referendums, same sort of thing. Voting is compulsory, and the key is to succeed. More than 50% of the voting population, as in Australians, have to vote in favour, and also more than 50% in a majority of states. So it's a combination sort of thing. And this is actually to, if you like, protect the smaller states. So the, or, you know, have your, most people, a high proportion of people are in New South Wales and Victoria. And the population of Tasmania can be fitted into a small part of Melbourne. So it's that sort of thing. Now, referendums rarely succeed for all sorts of reasons, but it may be that people don't actually understand politics, but who knows? Next, please. Okay, this is Alistair Campbell, who you should be familiar with from the British point of view, and he was interviewed a couple of weeks ago. And he likes compulsory voting. Several Americans that have come here for type conferences have actually said that the same thing, that they would prefer to have compulsory voting. And one of the reasons for that is that more or less you don't actually have to be bribed to turn up, because you have to turn up anyway, in that sort of sense. I like compulsory voting. I used to work on the, I should add that, I think I get to that later on. Next slide, please. Okay, this is Lech Blaine. Lech is actually named after Lech Walesa, the Polish person. He'd be in his 30s. He's an interesting writer. And this is what Alistair has said in the previous one is fine, but Lech is actually more down to earth. And it's interesting. I've worked on the polls on and off for 40 years, you know, as an employee. And it's fascinating how many people of various ages basically lose their consciousness when they walk into the polling booth. Have no idea what I'm doing. Or they want to vote for somebody that is in another state or something like that. So it's important to, one of the reasons why Australia is the country it is that usually Australians don't get fired up about politics. Okay, you want to compare that to a revival meeting that Donald Trump runs quite regularly, you know, which is an emotional contagion sort of thing. Next thing, please. Okay, the Constitution is intended to exclude particular others. That's a nice way of saying anybody that's not white. Okay, now this at one point, and this would be similar in the United States, would actually include Italians and Southern Europeans. So there used to be a thing called the dictation test. If we were going to let you in, you'd actually have to read something in a European language, and the immigration people would select the European language. You know, so this is just to make sure that you'd fail. So that kind of thing. There's similar immigration things in the United States. And there are some books, and they're in the references, that actually see the influence between the United States and Australia, which actually goes both ways. The Bulletin, which is a magazine of the late 19th century, which only folded about 20 years ago, their slogan was Australia for the white man. Okay, so the Indigenous weren't mentioned in the Constitution as the Constitution actually could enabled the federal government to actually make laws regarding Aboriginal people, but that didn't happen until 1967 when they were counted. Okay, now this actually meant in some respects, so I was never brought up, that they were acknowledged as human rather than part of flora and fauna. I've got an old Dewey Decimal catalogue here, which I use, and it's interesting. It comes from the 60s, but they tell you where things were categorised in the first place, and Aboriginal societies were actually classified a lot closer to primates than what they are now. You're actually in a different category. So, I mean, I don't know what people thought about that. Next one, please. Okay. The referendum comes from a response to what's called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, Uluru is the large rock in the centre of Australia, which actually connects a lot of songlines and ideas. Some people are really upset that it's no longer called Ayers Rock and that you can't climb it, but it depends. I've never been there. So there's a copy of the statement in the paper. And so this was really saying, in some respects, so statement from the heart, which is feeling. There's an argument that Indigenous cultures very often prefer feeling. One of the Native American blokes you encountered, Mountain Lake, said, "We think you white people are stupid because you decide things from the head, whereas we decide things from the heart." And it seems to be, doesn't mean that Indigenous people are all the same type, but the theme of their societies is feeling rather than the thinking that comes from Northern European societies. Okay, so there's a statement saying we want a voice, we want treaty, we want truth. Truth means we want people to know how badly we've been treated, you know, shot, poisoned, all that sort of thing over the time. Rejected out of hand, actually almost immediately, by the then federal government, which is kind of interesting. But the voice, well, I think we'll get to the voice. The voice really means we want you to listen to us about issues that concern us, which seems fairly straightforward, but that's sort of how it goes. There are treaty negotiations going on in Victoria at the moment, so which is kind of interesting. And some of the Indigenous people that didn't agree to the statement want treaty first in that sense. So anyway, next one, please. Okay, so the current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who I'm going to speculate prefers feeling, which is interesting given that the last several Prime Ministers have all preferred thinking as dominant or auxiliary. this was the first thing that Albanese said when he won the election. It was a surprise. So the idea was a voice to Parliament on issues that affect First Nations peoples. Okay, the referendum was scheduled for that particular date to vote yes or no to the proposition. Now, the opposition parties, the National Party actually used to be called the Country Party for context, decided to oppose. And one of the themes that they had was, if you don't know, vote no. They don't say, if you don't know, find out. In that sort of sense, the no camp included some Indigenous people, not for the same, their arguments about division and things like that. Campaign funding for both sides, and I don't know where it is. Oh, this is the referendum booklet that I'm mentioning there, the Australian Electoral Commission. Unlike the United States, the managing of elections is done by the government. Okay, so you don't have local groups or whatever, and you can't work on an election for the Electoral Commission if you have a political view and you express it. So you can't wear a T-shirt that says, you know, vote Conservative or vote Labor or something like that, and you actually have to be objective in that way. So anyway, so that's the referendum booklet. Did I read it? No, but that's for other reasons. Next one, please. There's the booklet. This is an example of a ballot paper, because Australian voting is pencil and paper. Some of the arguments against the referendum made claims that there were voting machines, and there are no voting machines in Australia. But it's interesting, all sorts of claims were actually made about voting, which says something about the unconscious nature of social media, but that's another thing. Next one, please. This came out a couple of weeks ago, and I liked it because it's about yes and no. Like to donate to the no campaign. No, not no, no. And so in the end, yes. So there are lots of donations. There was a limit to explain, you know, why are people donating to no or yes? A lot of corporations supported yes, and there are other groups that supported no for a particular thing. But anyway, I quite like that because of the language. Next one, please. Okay, now it was a volatile campaign. And in actual fact, this relates to what we're going to get to, which is Jung's idea of negative thinking. Claims of misinformation or lack of detail. Now, sometimes, and I say this in the paper, some people, this can be called closure in other ways. I want to know everything about A before I make a decision. So rather than, because the idea about the voice referendum is that there would be a voice, it'd be in the Constitution. So therefore, a governing party couldn't abolish it, which had happened before. And so, you know, there were those sorts of things. As I mentioned before, confusion between Australian and American constitutions and voting protocols. There are a number of people who actually think that the American Constitution is the Australian Constitution. And sometimes, apparently, in legal areas, there are people that will actually mention constructs that are American, not Australian. And that's because of what people watch on TV or streaming or whatever. 60% of voters in all of the states rejected the proposition. Okay, so whatever that was, no vote higher in regional areas and Western Australia and Queensland states. Now, Western Australia and Queensland are the places where there are lots of Indigenous people on their land. The Australian Capital Territory was the only area, which is where Canberra is, was the only area to vote yes. And some data that's recently coming out that a factor for people voting yes was their education. So the more highly educated they were, the more likely they were to vote yes. Now, having said that, I know a type person who's a friend of mine who voted no because he didn't feel accountable for what had been done to Indigenous people. So, which is kind of interesting because that wasn't the point. But people will vote yes or no for different reasons. A mate of mine, an ESTJ who I've known nearly all my life, he voted yes, and he described no people as simpletons, which is an interesting way of looking at it. Next one, please. Yeah, can I have the next?
Nathan, I was just pointing out Nathan has a question.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Sorry if the questions are premature, but I was wondering, was there any correlation with like left wing or right wing preferences, or even perhaps type preferences?
Well, there'd be no data on type preferences. The edge, but it's a good question about left and right wing. And notionally, the Labor Party is a left-wing organisation, but really the left wing is more or less the Greens, if you like. But it's hard to get data about people from either side of politics. If you were conservative in the general sense, because the Liberal Party here isn't really conservative, but it kind of is, then they would be more likely to say no. But then you've actually got the corporations that actually encourage you to vote yes. So it's sort of hard to work out. And that's why education is sort of how I might make my decision. My type might influence that, but it doesn't mean, see, I mean, I voted yes and I didn't read any of the information because I'd studied Aboriginal religions when I was at uni and I was interested in the topic. So I didn't need to be convinced. And I understood later that I actually voted yes for reasons that weren't in the referendum. So it depends on how it goes. We'll look at a cartoon later on with that. Okay, so, and this perhaps relates to your question here, responses to the voice. The next thing, awareness or interest. The data is that some people turn up and think, I have no idea why I'm here. And you think, well, what about all the information? Disinterest, I don't care. Fear, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on fear. Ideas of equality. The idea for some people was that giving Indigenous people a voice to Parliament was in actual fact unequal. And a friend of mine has actually said it's more about equity than that sort of thing. Now, yeah, I think I'll get to that later on. Ignorance, willful and otherwise, so I don't want to know. I don't want to make a decision. Logic, if this, then that. Doesn't have to be good logic. Something, it's a favourite phrase of mine, privileging the wrong information. This happens in type areas all the time. And any other area where you could be social media or something like that as well. And you can sort of say, oh, that's important, but it's not necessarily relevant to the to the question at hand. So it's not good thinking. And down the bottom, racism. The bad news is that Australia is considered to be a racist country in that sense. And very often this has to do with language, casual racism, and so on. I think I might say something about that later on. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay. This is a context in which Jung comes in. So researchers in the 19th and 20th centuries made distinctions between primitive cultures and more developed ones that were usually, but not exclusively, European. Okay, now, a lot of people these days, or certain people these days, will say, oh, there's no such thing as race because we biologically have the same origin. Now, that's fair. My view, though, is that if race is still a category in public and private discourse, you actually have to recognise it in that sense. There are some interesting books on Jungian thought and race. Now, some consider their ethnic background superior to any other. Now, that's more than Indigenous, non-Indigenous things. And this also applies to belief systems, religious and otherwise. Are my religious beliefs, if I have them, superior to yours? Well, some people will actually think so. Are my political beliefs superior to yours? Well, I might say that as well. So, I mean, there are those sorts of things. And also, some also consider that certain people still don't count as human. I mean, to a certain extent, that's kind of, it's not acceptable in a particular way, but it's also what I would say is normal, that there are people that don't think that. So, you know, do I think that people in Amazonia are human? Well, personally, I do, but there will be people that think that they don't because they don't live in a particular way. I mean, the argument used to be put here that Indigenous people were nomadic, but in actual fact, I had this pointed out to me by an Indigenous bloke. He said, you're the ones that came here. We've always been here, and we actually have our particular groups. Next one, please. Okay. Most of what I'm talking about is about communication. If you're a Scot, you should know Jack Bruce. But that's my view. He played bass with Cream and assorted other things. And so this is from a song. It's not what you don't say, it's the speed you don't say it with. So it's just something to think about. Mark Fisher is a Marxian, and you can buy a t-shirt, which I have, and I was nearly going to wear. All that is solid melts into PR. Okay, and what he means by that is that if there's a problem, well, then someone will actually come in, and you can see this in corporate ideas, but also in government. Someone will actually come in to lie on behalf of the organisation, or to actually not answer the question in that sort of way. And, you know, because we've got to sell a particular thing. Now, this is relevant because of various marketing and communication strategies that actually emphasize similar words to what we use in type, but they have different meanings. Can I have the next one, please? Okay. This is Jung. Actually, it says C.G. Jung's Ideas 1, but there's no 2. I deleted that, I think, anyway. Now, Jung is interesting. There are all sorts of issues with Jung, but he's actually very plain about particular things. So he says every conceptual formula is psychological in its essence. And what he means by that is that if I have a particular psychological orientation, what I'm actually going to write about or think is actually connected with that. So there are psychological presumptions about ideas. Jung says his concepts are based on empirical findings, and he's talking about a Central European idea of empiricism, not an American one, or actually an Anglo-American one, and are nothing but names for certain areas of experience. Okay, what he means by that is that I'm using these words, but they actually don't, they're not Platonic forms or concrete sorts of things. So when Jung uses the term thinking, he's not saying this is what I think thinking is. He said this is the word that I'm actually using for this particular thing. So, and this is Wolfgang Hockheimer. I've used this quite a bit in the things that I've written, and it's relevant to anything, but particularly either this discussion or anything about Jung or anybody. There are all sorts of things that are of interest to people when they're reading about somebody or finding out about them, and people attach themselves to whatever it is that they like. So I am not a person who uses John Beebe's model, because I think that's problematic, even though I know John and he's not an idiot. Okay, I have trouble with archetypes and complexes. My mind goes blank when I'm reading books about that. Okay, I'm interested in other sorts of things, and perhaps a sociological interpretation of whatever it is. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is to give you an idea about the variability of language. I wrote a paper, What is a Function, for one of the conferences here, which is actually available because I remembered it yesterday. What is a function? To a certain extent, people use function without thinking about what it means, or that it can mean other things. So this is Marie-Louise von Franz, and she says that the idea of the functions is practical, but it's not a dogma. Okay, so, and Jung would agree with that. And the term, I struggle with this one too, think of Brian Eno. It's a heuristic standpoint. So here's my idea. There are functions of the mind. These are the most important ones, and there may be others, but I like these ones. That's really what he says. So, and she points out that, okay, it's a good model, but that doesn't mean that everything fits into it. There are always exceptions, so exceptions that sometimes prove the rule. So I can be an INTP and I don't do A, but nearly every other INTP does it. Okay, so I'm the exception. But you can still get away with saying, but INTPs do A. But you have to actually get a response from the person to see how that works. Can I have the next one, please?
Peter, just to let you know, there's about 6 minutes left.
Oh. Genuinely frightening. Okay, we'll move on. Next one, please. Okay. Thinking and feeling, I've mentioned this. When people are actually doing marketing and sales and all that, thinking and feeling means thinking and emotion. Okay, it means something actually quite different in that sort of way. So it's a different sort of idea to what Jung's talking about. And so the voice referendum was largely about thinking and emotion, or a particular version of that. Next one, please. Those who use emotion, and this actually is in psychoanalytic areas as well, presume this is how you get people to change their minds. Now, this may be type related, but to me, the last thing that's going to get me to change my mind is something that's emotional, because I'm going to be in disarray in that sort of way. There's a book by an excellent book by Sally Weintraub that says, and she says, I'm an Extinction Rebellion person. And she's a psychoanalyst. And so she said, I'm going to change people's minds by appealing to their emotions. Really not very logical. Okay. No campaign used the emotions of fear and anger. And much of the thinking appeared to be similar to Jung's idea of negative thinking, which I think is the next slide, if we can have that. Okay, this is the first component. Jung actually says this in Psychological Types. So, and the main idea, and we'll go to the next slide, seeing as there's only a couple of minutes. When a man champions or advocates a cause, negative thinking makes no inquiry as to the importance of the thing, but merely asks, how much does he make by it? So you must actually have an ulterior motive. And Jung actually, to me, politics is about negative thinking. What's in it for him? What's in it for me? So why aren't I getting the access to Parliament that the Indigenous people will get for the voice? Now, the answer is you've got all these other departments that represent you, but that's another thing. So that's the idea. So what's in it for him? What's in it for me? Jung actually puts the boot into theosophical thinking as well, which is interesting given how you can go into a theosophical bookshop and there's Jung everywhere. Next one, please. Okay, these are the tabloidism is a word I made up. And these are the kinds of things that you'll see in a newspaper or online, things like that. They're all emotional. And the main idea is to create fear or whatever. I mean, there's been a few bits of violence in Sydney recently, and I was filling out a survey, and one of the questions was, do you actually feel safe in your environment? And I think, well, yeah, I'm not in Sydney, but even if I was in Sydney, that may, there's a presumption that you are wary about these things. Next one, please. Okay. John Cale, who's Welsh, fear is a man's best friend. That's about 50 years ago. Cale, I think, is an INTP who actually likes to mess with your head, or actually with your emotions. I quite like that. Peter Harch is a local journalist. Alexis Wright is an Indigenous woman who is a novelist, but also a thinker in other ways. And she's making a comment about that. Next one, please. This is Fiona Katauskas, who you can see her stuff on the Guardian Australia website. And this is the paradox. Imagine if someone just took your land. You think, well, yeah. This is actually what people like him did in that sort of sense. Next one, please. Okay, this is Alexis Wright really actually saying, well, fear actually interferes with the idea of how to understand self and others. Next one, please. Then she says, well, what happens if we're letting people that are more powerful and more fearful than ourselves to do the thinking for us? And that's actually a really good point. That's a good international point as well. Next one, please. Okay, this is Umberto Eco, who I quite like. He has a good book called Mouse or Rat, which is about translation. And the title is worth the money. So trying to understand other people means destroying the stereotype without denying or ignoring the otherness. So there are other books that I've referenced that sort of say, well, to actually say I don't see any colour or I treat people the same is actually missing the point. You actually have to say these people are different. A counsellor I see is a Muslim woman, and I asked her recently about her experiences of racism here, what it's like in this particular country. Next one, please.
I'll just say Peter's got about 6 slides left, so should we let him finish, as we're at 9 o'clock now? But
I'd like to. I'm really into this. I'm enjoying this, so I'd say yes.
Oh, thank you. You've made my morning. This is Deborah Cameron, the linguist. This is actually from a book about men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And she actually points out that there's no evidence to support that at all. She's also written an excellent book on political correctness, which came out before this. So she says, well, okay, stereotyping is what other people do, but we all do it to some degree. It's relevant for type and that. Next one, please. Okay, so, and then she points out, well, there's a downside to all this. It's much easier to notice the prejudices of other times and other cultures than it is to examine our own beliefs with a critical eye. Next one, please. And then she says, well, many psychologists would argue that stereotypes are useful because they give you shortcuts in understanding people, and that's fine. Next slide. Actually, there should be another slide in there, which obviously I've deleted, which says that it's not necessarily helpful perception to, it'll be in the paper anyway, so I apologise for that. Participation mystique is what I'm going to finish with. This is actually where I started thinking about the voice and all that. Participation mystique is an idea from the anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. I have his English translation here, and he applied this to primitives. And Jung actually uses the same. Jung quotes from Lévy-Bruhl in Psychological Types. So Lévy-Bruhl suggests that these primitives could lose their consciousness in a group setting or actually in other sorts of things. I've seen an Indigenous man from the Northern Territory. He was a Brolga man, and so he gave a performance is the wrong word, in which he became the Brolga. If you get my drift, so there's that aspect of it all. Jung actually uses this in a particular way, but he also says that this can actually happen in more developed societies, that people lose themselves to the object or to the group. And Lévy-Bruhl later said, actually 20 or 30 odd years later, that you could also see this in so-called developed societies. Now, my view, and it doesn't have to be exactly the same, is that you can see this in sporting crowds, political rallies, which just think of Donald Trump. It's just so easy. And other mass gatherings where people get really excited and there's a group sort of thing, so they lose themselves to the group. And you can see a lot of this in advertising and all that, where you know, it's going to be Christmas, and so everyone's sitting around a table and they're all ecstatic, which is actually a psychological problem, but that's another thing. Can I have the next one, please? Okay, it also made me think of Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, and here I'm thinking sociologically, okay, which is different to the way Jung is looking at it. But if you have an idea and it's the same thing as thinking, how does it overlap with other ideas and that sort of idea? So Jung actually says, I think this is in his letters, this unconscious is like the air. It's just the same everywhere. It's breathed by everybody and it belongs to no one. So you go up to Scotland and there's the air in Scotland that perhaps informs you unconsciously of what it's like to be Scottish. I'm making this up, but I'm thinking that that's partly how the kind of thing works. I mean, what's the feeling of being Australian? You know, and it's feeling in the non-function sense. What's the feeling of being English or British or whatever? And so to a certain extent, sometimes you can be influenced by ideas that you actually don't agree with. And you think, why did I think that? Why did I say that? I think that might be in the next one, if I can have the next slide. Okay. And this is, I got to the idea of conformity. I've never been good at conformity, but that may not surprise you. And this is because I was reading Cass Sunstein's book on conformity. He's the inventor of nudge, which is not what I like, but Sunstein is an interesting writer. And are all these things that I've mentioned conscious choices, or do you just sort of pick it up on the way? So fashion, you know, brands. I mean, why do you want to have a personal brand? I don't understand that. Then again, I did have an INTP car, so that depends on how you want to look at it. Logos on T-shirts. So in the voice referendum, people actually had, the people that said no had the word division on their black T-shirt. The people that actually said yes actually had yes in Indigenous colours. Okay, feelings or sentiments. People always, these days in particular, actually ask you how you feel. Now, this could be a personal problem, but generally I have no idea. And so you might fill out a survey, and I get these occasionally. What are you feeling right now? And my response, and you've got about 20 words or whatever, and I go down the bottom and say, I don't answer questions like this, and then move on. Okay, haircuts and beards. Otto Krager actually said once, this is a long time ago, he was talking to someone on the phone and he said, look, about stereotypes. And he said to this bloke, he said, well, I've told you I'm a psychologist. I said, so do you think I'd have a beard? And the answer was yes. So there's those kinds of judgments. I have a beard because I'm terrible at shaving. That's my initial response. And one part of my head is actually different to the other, but that's another thing. But I'm fascinated by hair and haircuts because people spend all their time in barbershops and things like that. You're watching football or whatever it is, and there are all these people, they spend all their time doing whatever. Now, are they doing it to fit in? Are they doing it because they're making a choice and say, I like that? Or anything, and you don't know. You actually have to ask them and they may not know. So I've gone bald. I don't like that, but that's reality. I would never do a Shane Warne, if you like, and get implants and things like that. But I'd prefer to, in the old days, I had shoulder length hair, and which was entertaining as a customs officer. Okay, jargon of any kind. I hate jargon, and it can be obfuscatory, hiding what is, people say, oh, I'm reaching out to somebody, which to people of my vintage reminds me of the Four Tops or something like that. But reaching out is in actual fact an evangelical phrase. So why don't you say, well, I'm talking to somebody? It's the plain words. There are always support places online and elsewhere. And I mean, that's a psychological term. Actually, it's a therapeutic term. And here, there are a lot of people that should know better that actually say, thank you so much, which is an American phrase, and they've picked it up and they sort of use it. And you think, you really sincere about that? But anyway, that's my issue. Mass gatherings. Taylor Swift was here a couple of months ago, and it was really participation mystique. Now, I'm going to tell you that I have never heard a note of her stuff, even though I've got 900 CDs here. So it depends. But, mass gatherings, this is where people lose their minds. And so that's how you're going to conform. So why aren't you being with the group? That sort of thing. Social media. And finally, tattoos. I'm bewildered by tattoos because when I grew up, you knew that the people that had tattoos, particularly if you were playing underage football, are actually going to fix you up. There was going to be a bit of violence. They were tough people. These days it's entirely different. And you wonder why people do this. Are people getting tattoos and not reading books? But that's my question. Okay. I think the next one's the last one. Okay. No conclusion, and I would have liked to have had some, but the main idea is this is what I'm thinking, and that perhaps the kinds of words we use and the kinds of structures that we use, we need to actually have more nuance about it, or not to, well, I suppose not to make judgments about people. So it's sort of asking people, why did you do that? Or why do you think that? And you don't sort of then say, well, you're an idiot then, or something like that. You say, oh, that's interesting. So just to learn how people actually go about things. And that's really the idea. Because I mean, the voice referendum was badly managed, in my view, in a language sense, and I say this in the paper. But it's partly because of the way people think, or think that other people can be communicated with. That's sort of relevant. So,
well, thank you, Peter. I'm going to suggest that Jerry could stop recording now, but we can continue.